Buenos dias, amigos. Es la 10 en Redmond, Washington, y llega tiempo a .NET API Review. Yo soy Zorro. Happy Halloween. All right, that was a lot of work for very little. There's like
But I
5 people
appreciate it,
watching.
Jeremy.
Someone may have laughed. Okay. Right. We have a lot of stuff on the backlog these days, so good job filing issues. And for complicated reasons, I think we're going to end up wrapping at 11. So let's get started. First up, we have provide a configurable overload of memory cache entry options for the commonly used method get or create in memory cache extension. Adam said he couldn't be here today, but that it's easy. So does anybody understand what's going on and can talk about this?
Yeah, I think I can do it.
Okay.
So there's this get or create stuff on Microsoft extensions, caching memory, and they ask the get or create method only retrieves I think the value of the cache entry. And it only it does it only if it tries to get it or create it. So there is no way for the when it tries to create it. Currently, there is no way to set options using this method. So this person is trying to suggest an additional options parameter that is set when you get into the create path of the get or create for the cache entry.
Okay, so it's just overloading an existing get or create and putting a parameter on the end?
Yeah.
It seems reasonable to me, I guess. Assuming that get has a thing that takes in options. Sorry, that create has a thing that takes in options.
Yeah, create entry. There is something to set options on the cache. I mean, not exactly create entry. I think it's a separate method to set the options, but yeah, it does it. My only concern was that the parameter was going to only apply to the create case on the get or create, but that's might be not a problem.
Yeah, I mean, so the name is scrolled off because it's long. So it might make sense to call it create options. Just to clue that it's only used on create.
Sounds good to me.
Good question. The class doesn't exist yet, right?
No, it does.
Why can't I not find it then?
Oh, it's I think it doesn't have the right name on the. Are you looking for the memory cache extension?
Yep.
Just look cache extension. I think it's called without the memory.
So we're not changing the name, right? We're keeping the name. We just add the new methods to it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Okay, so where it says it's in system collections generic memory cache extensions, it meant Microsoft extensions caching memory cache extensions?
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, that's quite the namespace too. Microsoft extensions.caching.memory. Wow. Yeah.
What does it mean for the T item that's being returned from this to be null? Like when?
I think it's so this thing, I think this is backed by a concurrent dictionary with object key. I guess if it doesn't find it, oh sorry, it's just in the try get entry. So I guess if it doesn't find it, it's gonna return null.
But if it doesn't find it, it's going to call create.
Right. And
Ah.
creates func, at least according to the signature, returned a non-nullable T item.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking too.
I see.
Well,
Or returned a T item, but it doesn't explicitly require being T item question mark in the return. So I don't know
Right.
why this isn't just returning a T item.
well, using Emo's syntax here, where he paints not null for not null and nothing when it could be null, I think it says the current one is T item question mark in the factory, which means we have to actually go look at the type.
Well, with generics, it's a bit special, but
The thing I don't understand is in what's currently on the screen, there's a question mark after T item in the return type, but not
right.
in the func.
Right, but looking at the existing getter create, I think that there's supposed to be a question mark in the func.
Let me just look at the source.
Yeah, it's
Also, I'm pretty sure that I render a question mark for nullable. Like if you don't see anything, it basically means indifferent.
Yeah, so there's no question mark on that T item in the func return.
Right. So I think this would be oblivious, right?
fair enough.
But I mean, I don't understand. Like conceptually, like clearly the code on the screen does not return null, right? Ever.
Well, I guess
I mean, the factory could if you don't check it.
is the concern that someone might call cache, like separate from this, they might call cache.add with a null result.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
That's awful.
So the get can return null always?
Yeah, so it's nullable because you might successfully retrieve the value from the dictionary and that value might be null because somebody else might have put it into the cache without going through T item.
Fair enough. Also, it could be the wrong T item, which will just be a class
Exception.
cast exception. So yay.
Yeah.
Okay, well that seems consistent with the other one. Like it looks like it matches the current signature, so the question marks are
So what is this? I didn't quite follow. So what is this new thing? How does this new thing differ from the existing one?
it takes
Just
options.
that
Right?
it takes options.
Yes.
yeah, so that
Should
Click.
those options be null? Like if you're gonna pass null, why not just use the one that doesn't take one?
Usually that's done because you're calling this as part of something else, which has an optional thing. So then you either you accept it to be optional yourself, or you force your caller to choose which API to call based on whether it was given a null one or not.
I see.
It's annoying, but memory cache entry options already exists, right? That's not a new thing.
Already exists.
And that's used as part of the get or the create or both.
No, it's for the create.
Does the factory need that?
Set needs it.
No, I think the factory is to get the value, right?
right. So like
Can you show
so here's
what
set,
is-
which is you give it a thing and then it calls set options on it. So the value and the options are parallel on the cache entry.
Yeah.
And this
What-
one calls create entry and doesn't call set options.
Can you just click on the options so I can see what's on it?
When it expires.
You scroll down a little. Expiration, callbacks, size. Seems fine, I guess.
Yeah.
I was trying to think that if there's a situation where what T item you create would be based on those options, but if it's probably, I guess it's probably rare enough that if you did, you would just capture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then chat asks, can't you just call set options inside the factory? But the factory returns entry.value and entry.options is what the options would be setting. So the factory is at the wrong scope in the data hierarchy. So yeah, seems fine to me with options renamed to create options. What are you laughing at?
So I just saw on the screen there was a set that returns the item, and I don't understand why it does that, but because you pass it in, right? So I don't understand why you return.
Probably
But
for Fluent. A lot of ASP.NET stuff is Fluent.
Yeah, but then you'd be like cache.set
yeah,
key
and
comma value like dot toString. Like that's just weird. Yeah, set
I
should
don't
be
know
weird.
what you.
Lots of people like Fluent APIs.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand when you would return the cache itself, right? But it seems weird to return the item. It's like,
Yeah.
would you expect that after set you dot into the item?
Right. Like
Seems to be wrong.
I like if you're gonna chain things, it seems like the Fluent pattern is return this, not return the third parameter.
Yeah, it may be obvious, but not all of these went through an API review board like this did. Even as much as we like Fluent APIs in ASP.NET, I don't think this would have like withstood discussion.
Fair enough. All right. Anything else?
So what was the conclusion why we return nullable? Because it might be the cache might be pre-populated with a null that didn't come from the func. Was that what we said?
Yep.
Yeah. Somebody
Also, the
can have
existing
assigned
getter
null
creates-
as a value. So it is cached. It's just cached as null.
I think that's a little bit of us assuming as well, but the existing getter create also returns nullable T item. So
I mean, what Jeremy just said would make sense to me, but then it would make more sense if the func itself would return a nullable T item. That would make more sense to me.
I think it's that this is just an extension sitting on top of iMemory cache, which is non-generic. So anyone can go through and put anything in. Someone
see.
could have called get or create with T item question mark, and then they could have called get or create with T item.
Yeah, because the
Right,
T
but
item's only on the method.
But when we added nullable annotations, why did we not take the func as a func that returns a nullable item?
Because that func might not return a nullable item. The person's defining that, like the. Sorry, my dog's barking a second.
I thought the delegates worked so that you could have a delegate that doesn't return null passed into one that does return null, but not the inverse.
I don't remember what the covariant rules are around. But that sounds like something we would do. But I mean, regardless, if you have get or create that takes a T item, I can call that with string question mark with a func that returns null. And then I can call it again with string. And even though I've specified string, the result will be null because the previous call validly cached a null.
Yeah.
That being said, if we made the func for the factory return nullable T item, like I don't think anyone would complain, right? It's not like we actually null check or throw or anything, right? Like it would continue to work the same.
I can slap on some extra question
It would,
marks.
except with it. Well, where you might complain is if, and we've had this debate about other APIs, is if someone is specifying that their domain is non-nullable. Part of the promise of nullable reference types is you get warnings if you do something that might be violating that. So if someone says get or create string, and then they have a func that returns null, that should produce a compiler warning. And if we explicitly make it T item question mark, then we're saying, I don't actually care about your annotations. We're not going to give you warnings.
Makes sense to me. Yeah, I'm not suggesting we actually change it.
I didn't quite follow that, Stephen. Like because to me it sounds like we would say, you know, the func that you specify can return nullable because we just said the cache can contain null values, right? Like, why would you want a warning in that case?
Because if you say get or create open brace string close brace, you're saying I work in terms of non-nullable strings, and then you specify a func that returns null. That null is violating the very constraint that you just expressed, that you're working in terms of non-nullable strings, and so you expect that to produce a compiler warning that you're using null where you said I don't want null.
Yeah, and furthermore, right, T-item doesn't have a non-nullable constraint, right? So if you want to allow nullable from your factory, then just put the question mark.
Then you specify string question mark. Exactly.
Yeah, like, so it's not preventing you from like using null if you want to. So it's really just goodness to like
it's the same reason
through the nullability through the generic parameter. Sorry.
I was going to say, it's the same reason like on weak reference and strong box and elsewhere where, you know, like weak reference of T's constructor takes a T, and we don't have it take a T question mark. So if you construct a new weak reference of string, not string question mark, and you pass null, that will warn.
Right. But in our case, we always return a T-item question mark, right? So even if you specify the get or create item as string, not string question mark, it will still give you back a string question mark, right?
From the result, sure, but you're passing in a delegate that should also be checked.
Right, like if you were very careful and always use get or create with a non-nullable factory, you could like reasonably cast out the nullability, like when you get later, if you're using just those get or create APIs, and then you get warnings if your factory was wrong.
You're basically saying if you specify string, then you should not provide a factory that can return nullable string. Sure, I buy that.
The real oddity here is that this isn't the only way to get something into the cache, and therefore the result might always be nullable, even if you said I'm putting in a non-nullable thing.
Yeah.
And there's kind of nothing with the design of this API. There's kind of nothing we can do about that.
Yeah, it's a bit weird to have non-generic data structure and then a generic API over it, because by definition you're lying, right?
Yeah.
It's type erasure.
You're creating a nice little illusion for yourself.
Except for not really. I mean, I guess at least the type's still there. We're not Java. We can do reflection on it.
Well, I mean, yeah, the type is there at runtime. That's also true in JavaScript, right? It's just you don't get to see it.
Yeah.
But there's nothing preventing you from having a cache that stores customers and then you index into it using a string, right? Like it's everything will compile. It's just not going to work.
All right. So are we good with that?
So Jeremy, this is not a costume. This is what I look like. This is my authentic self.
How dare you, sir?
Yeah, except you made fun of me for, making a Bavarian reference once. And so I know it's not your authentic self. Aber ich bin Bayer. Alright.
Selbstverständlich.
Alright, sounds like we're not adding more question marks. So posted. Alright. Next up is finishing off more granular X509 certificate loader 91763.
This is the third one. Third time we look at it, right?
It's only the second.
I thought there were 2 review comments already on this.
No, it got skipped last week because both you and Steve were out. so it's only one.
I see. I see.
Okay, so basically this is just a final review of the names because we ran out of time, and there's a little bit of shape. So we've reduced the model down to the new loader, which again will live in a new type so that it can be transported back to framework. We have load certificate, which loads the base X509 certificate type. It takes in the 3 types that we support and returns the one type we care about. And then we have load PKCS12, which is what the current constructor does if you give it a PFX. It returns the best certificate. And then we have load PKCS12 collection, which is if you have a collection and you collection.import. There is one question about shape that we didn't talk about last time, which is these should have all been void. Copy paste error. So the current model we have for dealing with a collection is you've instantiated the collection and you call import, but my gut says most of the time when people call import they only do it once on a collection. So I have 2 different shapes here. One is you give it the inputs and it allocates the collection, loads the stuff into the collection and returns it. And then this other one, where these should have all been void, is it takes the collection to add to as the last required parameter. And I mean, they can also be not void. And so then one of the questions for this group is, do we want both patterns or just one of them?
Wait, so when I say load and I both take a collection and return a collection, what am I doing? What?
Yeah, this is I think I copied the driver method that's actually doing the work instead of what the public signature was supposed to be. So my intention was this was void.
Okay, that's what you were just saying earlier.
Yeah. Otherwise, it's return the third parameter.
Got it. Okay. Okay, so a couple questions. There's always a password for these?
Because the PFX always has a password, yeah.
Okay.
We're getting rid of the we'll fill it in for you scenario.
So that doesn't need to be nullable or anything.
I guess it can be null. Null is a different password than empty. We don't treat, we internally say you probably weren't smart enough to know the difference between them, because only 6 people in the world know the difference between them. So if you try null or empty, we also try the other one if the one doesn't work, but technically they're different.
What does null mean for the span? If I pass in null for the span, does it have the right semantics, or is that the same as empty?
Again, we'll try both ways.
Okay.
And then for the path, that's like a file path?
Yep. So.
And the API behaves just as if you did file.readAllBytes and then called the byte array one?
Oh, you would think that, wouldn't you?
Oh god. What does it actually do?
It does that unless you're on Windows and the path is a symlink, in which case it throws. I don't know why. That's what the underlying Win32 API does. It won't follow a symlink.
Okay, that's awesome.
But this is, it's just these constructors. I mean, we may be able to fix it with this, because I think it's related to where it's asking if the file happens to be authentic code signed. So it may actually be the same as if you did read all bytes, but without allocating it in the middle. But yeah, it's just, this constructor. Or I guess here it was called file name, so maybe I should have called it file name.
Is this similarly unsupported on browser?
Yeah, because certificates are not supported on browser.
Okay.
So
the whole class is unsupported.
Yeah. And since it's a static type, putting the unsupported on the type is reasonable. It won't screw up anybody's signatures.
And then how do I think about the difference between load certificate and load PKCS12 or whatever? Like, I will know which I'm supposed to use.
Yep.
You asked Jeremy.
Yeah, I mean, so it, if we wanted to say it's file extension, if you're loading a .pfx, PFX and PKCS12 are the same thing. We can change PKCS12 in this to PFX if we want. So if you're loading a PKCS12, you call load PKCS12. If you're loading a SIR, you would call load certificate. 99.9% of the time, if you don't know what you have, you only wanted the certificate, which means you'd call load certificate. That 1% will find out they're wrong.
But like if I've just been given a byte array that represents the certificate, I have to know which of these methods to call. Is that right?
If you've just been given a byte array that represents a certificate, then it's 9/9 likely that it's this one. If you're accepting a PFX, then you're doing something weird, and you're something like Azure Key Vault that is explicitly trying to store a private key on your behalf.
I guess to add some clarity to this, just X509 Certificate 2's constructor accepts both as kind of these interchangeable things. That is a very unique thing, I think, in the API shape of .NET. Most people are going to know, to some extent, whether they're having a certificate or a PKCS12. If they're genuinely not sure, then they're going to have to try one and see which one works. Most people are going to know because there is going to be some password associated with a PKCS12. So if they're given some byte array and a password, they're probably going to know they need to use a PKCS12.
Yeah.
The thing that I totally defer to you, Kevin, and to you, Jeremy. Like I'm just raising questions because I'm genuinely wondering. Both of these methods return a certificate, so I'm just confused by the naming of load certificate versus load PKCS12. But they both return a certificate, so it's weird that one is named after the return type and one isn't.
Yeah, so this is another Brian Lamacchia-ism.
Well, it's a lot based off of Windows to some extent, but it's an X509 Certificate 2 isn't just a certificate. It can be a certificate with a private key associated with it, or just a certificate. So the PKCS12 loader is going to load the certificate, and it's going to associate a private key with it, which is what that get RSA private key or get ECDSA public key, all the whatever key type you have. The fact that we just kind of jammed the concept of certificate plus key into one class called X509 Certificate 2 is why it returns the same thing.
So really, these methods are load certificate and load certificate with private key. But there's a name for certificate with private key that is PKCS12, so we've substituted that language in.
Yes, PKCS12 is the standard for how a certificate and a private key, which are two distinctly separate things, get encoded into one byte blob.
And then the PKCS12 can contain multiple certificates and multiple keys, and it can figure out how to pair them together.
So what happens when we get PKS 13?
Well, I mean, we can say the number of formats supported by this type hasn't changed since .NET Framework 2.0, so it seems unlikely. The industry kind of finished adding formats here, and unless you count the JSON equivalents and stuff, stopped adding things in 1995.
I mean, it could be also a completely new format, right? That is not even PKCS, right? So I guess my question is, would it be better if we had one method like load with private key that would do the right thing? Or would we expect if there were a different format, then we really want a different overload because, well, maybe you can't even parse it out, right? Maybe you have to know.
Like the loader limits, whatever the new format is, would potentially have completely different security limit or work limit boundaries. So it would be a very different thing.
Different method.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess that's fair then.
Yeah. So for the people who do need to maintain the current, I don't know, I take stuff and I do stuff, they can avoid the try one thing and then the other by calling the get content type, which is the, it's like file on Unix. So it looks at the payload and tells you which of all these formats it is. We just removed all of the Windows specific and esoteric formats from the loader last time.
Makes sense.
Right. So, yeah. So there's.
So one other question I had is, so you overload byte array and span of bytes. Have we? I mean, other crypto APIs we have given up on this, right? We just folded them together into just span, right? Have you not?
We may have on some of the super power user, like Kevin is the only person in the world who's ever going to call it APIs.
Mhm.
But in general, I think we're still doing byte and read-only span a byte. Sorry, byte array and read-only span a byte.
And I think for framework folks, since we're down level shipping this, we generally try to have byte arrays when we know we're going to be supporting other frameworks.
And you think of this as not as a power user API, right? This is really like, if you load certificates, you should be using this one here, right?
We're obsoleting the existing constructors.
Yeah.
Like, if you need certificates, use this type. So this is the mainline scenario for loading certificates.
So basically, we are saying we believe there's value in those overloads for simplicity.
Mhm.
I have to say, I'm not a huge fan of overloading byte array and then to string file path, but I guess we have done this in other APIs as well. It's not great, but it is what it is.
I mean, we can. I think there was even a comment in the issue of like, can we just remove the one that loads it from path? And I don't.
Yeah, the reason I say that is because very often when we have like, span of bytes and then another overload that takes string, is usually like UTF-8 versus UTF-16, right? So you would expect that to be both the same kind of thing, just different encodings. This was actually going to the file system, whereas the other one just takes the bytes.
I mean, we could also rename the ones that do it from file and stick a from file on the name. There is like the loading from file is more optimal in that it won't create an intermediate structure, and the native readers can detect like, oh, I hit the end of the payload, but the file kept going without needing to have ever really read it. So
I would go the other way around probably. I would probably suggest take the ones that just process the bytes that you give it to it as parse, and keep the ones that hit the file system and keep them load, because that's what we do in other places. Right? xdocument.load will load from a file system, and xdocument.parse will just, read the payload that you give it.
For some precedent, if you look on the X509 Certificate 2 class, when we added the PEM loading APIs, we have the ones that take the PEM contents, and then we stuck the word file at the end of the ones that accept files. We had to do it there because it was overloaded by read-only span of car and string, and that was just not going to work. But if you're looking for some consistency, that's one place we could look for.
I mean, that works too. I mean, I guess it depends on how high level you want this API to be, right? I'm just saying, in all the other places where we have the discrepancy between you pass the payload as a string versus you give it a file path, we have load versus parse usually, right? But that's, maybe we don't want that here.
I do think that overloading it by path and byte array will make the obsolescence transition a little bit easier. Like I know it's a really, just like, okay, fine, I'm getting teased on, people are going to know. I hope people know if they're dealing with file paths or with, byte arrays. So it's not a big decision for them, but I think like just every little like friction point we add from going from the constructors to the new thing is just going to be a little bit, different. So
Yeah. There's no string encoding for this, right?
Correct.
It's always going to be bytes, right?
Well,
Sorry.
for
For what?
the PEM one,
We don't.
I was going to say that when we load byte arrays or read-only spans, whatever, we will take a peek at it and try to determine if it is a UTF-8 / ASCII encoded PEM certificate. But I don't think that means we have to expose anything like encoding publicly in the API surface.
Yeah, I guess it's less about whether the underlying data is string. It's more like, will you ever, like with XML, right? It's pretty common to have XML represented as a string, right? So like you kind of want an API that just takes the XML as a string, right? Versus all I'm saying is if you say string is path, then, well, that's what you have. You cannot change your mind later and say, well, we would like to have an API that just takes the data as a string, right?
Oh no,
Because
there
you
would
already
never
said
be.
that's a path.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is
There,
a question of
I was
if
going to
we
say,
would want to copy the create from PIM onto this type, but
I think I see what Emo's saying, though. If you go back to the API proposal, there is a risk that somebody could pass a PEM blob into load certificate that takes the string path. I think we've had a couple issues filed in the runtime repo where they're like, hey, it's not loading my PEM certificate, but it's expecting a path, not an actual literal PEM.
Right.
yeah,
So,
I mean,
let's
jump down here of like sticking file on the end seems reasonable.
Yeah. I mean that and the only thing is I think like to Kevin's point is like I don't know exactly how that maps to the existing constructors, right? So
The string ones
if
would
it's
point to file, and the byte ones would point to the non-file.
yeah, that seems fine to me. Like this is not the kind of stuff where you expect a lot of call sites, right? You would expect that if somebody uses that, they do it in a few places maximum, right?
Yeah.
Like this is not like a collection library that you use like 1,000 times from your code base, right? So you would expect the average person to get like maybe 1 or 2 obsolete warnings and then having to figure out what to do. So in that case, I think it's fine if one goes there, one goes the other.
Yeah. Load PKCS 12 easily becomes load PKCS 12 file. I don't know what to call when it's the collection format. Is that load PKCS 12 collection file? Load PKCS 12 collection from file?
Can they all just be from file?
Sure, they can all be from file.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, so how do we feel about the 1 versus 2 collection patterns?
So help me understand again how the void versus non-void ones. What's the difference again?
So the void ones are exactly mirroring X509 certificate 2 collection.import in that you have to have already had a collection and then we're going to load data into it. So you pass it, it's the third parameter here.
So is the first one behaviorally equivalent to new X509 certificate 2 collection, call load PKCS 12 collection with that thing you just constructed and then return the thing that you constructed?
Yep, and that's why the driver method actually returns it, because it then just returns the third parameter, so they can both be written in terms of it.
So the first one is a complete helper,
Yeah.
a 3-line helper on top of the second one.
Right, just matching that my gut says anytime anybody loads the collection, they've just said new collection to do so.
Yes, sir.
So very dumb question then. Why do we not make the second one either an extension method of the collection or just an instant. I guess we can't make an instant method because we're not Uber it, right? But like, why don't we just say you say collection dot import, and then it just becomes an overload of import, basically. Right? Logically, you just basically have an overload of import that takes the loader limits, right?
So the problem would be if it's an overload of import that takes the loader limits, then the default doesn't become defaults. The default becomes unsafe. Do what the system already does.
Okay, sure. Then maybe don't make an overload, just have a new name. I'd say, either load or. All I'm saying is like it seems like logically you want this to be an instance method because you're effectively doing something to the collection, right?
Okay, so you would do just
I would
move
take
this
the
to the
collection as
top
the
and make
first
it a
argument
this.
and make it this, yeah.
Yeah.
Hey, but to your comments, Jeremy, who do we expect to use the second one?
If somebody really does want to load like 4 things and they want to complain about the allocation cost of the extra collections. So you, if you cared about certs.
But functionally, it's no different than saying my existing collection dot add range load pkcs12 collection.
Correct.
Yeah, my care level is close to 0. This doesn't strike me as the thing you do often enough that allocations would matter.
Yeah, you're doing PKCS12, then Earth is not
Indeed.
the thing you're most worried about.
Well, I mean, also from a scenario standpoint, right? This is not the thing you do on every request, right? This is a very rare thing usually. I would expect.
You're gonna probably load a PKCS12 or a collection on app startup on average, is what I expect most people to use it for. I'm starting my web server. I need a Surface certificate. I'm gonna load it from PKCS12. There it is.
Yeah, I would vote to keep the surface area simpler.
Yeah.
By getting rid of the second one.
Okay.
I would agree with that. And I would say if you ever bring it back, I would just bring it back as extension methods, not as static workers.
Okay, we added file to the file. Loading ones.
Especially in crypto world where there are strange differences for things that seem innocuous. The fewer choices I have to make, the better. I could totally imagine a world where there was a fundamental difference between loading into an existing collection versus loading into a new one. I'm glad to hear that there's not. And given that there's not, nice to avoid me having to even think about it by just having the one that creates a new one.
Oh yeah, that's the difference between implementing PKCS_A and PKCS12_B, right? So clearly you need to know which one you want to use.
Genau.
Clearly.
Yeah, I'm fine getting rid of the extension methods, or the not extension methods, the add to existing collection methods too. But I missed, why did we prefer extension methods over instance methods on the collection?
Well, for starters, because I think like it's, to me in this case, really what you do is you are manipulating fundamentally the collection, right? So it makes more sense to say collection dot import stuff into this, right?
Which is in fact
I
the
think
existing method.
The answer to your question, Stefan, I think is oob.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, all right.
Yeah.
It is.
Oh, you're asking like whether we make it an extension method rather than an instance method, or
Yeah.
Oh,
But I'm
okay.
fine getting rid of the thing that adds to an existing collection if it doesn't matter.
boundary. So just because the only way that you can do the current collection is with the instance import, and so
Yeah.
I did that, and then was like, but I don't think it's what people want. So then I made the one that they want.
Right. Because I assume also collections are kind of rare-ish, right? Most of the time you deal with one anyway, right?
Most people don't load PFXs as a collection, and then the people who do think it does things other than what it does.
So you're saying they're wrong.
They think it like cares that it was a coherent chain when really it's just a collection. And then they'll think like, well, I loaded all these things from the same file. They clearly know about each other. It's like, no, it did more than one thing. It's a collection. Okay, I think we were good with the names from on the loader limits. I guess for one, calling it loader limits, and then we have defaults, dangerous, no limits, the copy constructor that we added last time, is read only and make read only that we added last time, and then just every individual limit that somebody can set if they have opinions, but 9 nines of people are going to use one of these two.
I assume that max certs equals null is a typo, and it should be max certificates.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, because we renamed search to certificates last time.
Cool.
And so if there's nothing on that, then it's the.
And real quick, did we ever? I feel like did we ever sort out the auth saves thing?
So last time we had come up with. Somewhere up here I have the notes. That it was called encrypted segments, and if we decide it's encrypted items, meaning it won't load shrouded keys, we should call it items, and if it's encrypted auth safes, we should call it auth safes. And
Did we prove that it's auth saves somewhere? Or did we do like a conditional approval on we'll do it one or the other once we figure it out?
Yeah, the way that I view it is it was the conditional approval one way or the other. The Windows equivalent functionality is both, sort of, because they'll only ignore encrypted auth safes if they're also only loading, or if they're also ignoring private keys. So we get to make up whatever we want
Okay.
here.
Okay.
And then for all of these defaults, like the 300,000 and whatnot, I assume that's basically finger in the wind. Do we pick something that seemed reasonable, or is there some sort of concrete reason behind those exact numbers?
We've used them in other places for some other loader limits that have been put in place for PKCS 12.
Yeah, like these are, I believe, the Windows default internal limits. These are, I think, the default internal limits for Windows, and this is the limit that we put in June. So all of these are, all of the things with numbers are based on existing things, and then these preserve versus ignores are opinionated. It's called preserve if I think it should be false by default, and it's called ignore if I think it should be, well, false by default, but in the other way.
And that's purely because we don't want things to be true by default?
Yeah, so if you're loading a PKCS 12, you probably want the private keys. There are people who've come up with scenarios of I just want to know what was in this file and not bother with the part where Windows wants to write it to the hard drive as part of loading it. And then I'm doing a weird peeking thing, so don't decrypt things if you don't have to, is what this other one is. And then the rest of these are turning off esoteric Windows features that most people don't want, but occasionally they do want. So,
but the reason the last two are ignored instead of preserve is because you wanted them to be false rather than true?
Yeah, just to convey their default with their name.
I don't feel super strongly about it. The number of people that are going to be using this is, I don't know, very small.
Yeah.
I have trouble with the double negative, but
fair enough. Because on these, it's if something is here, if something is inside the file, should I use it? And this is if these things are in which, I mean, it is sort of the same. If they're in the file, should I read them?
I think it's just kind of based on what your expectations are. Like, most people don't expect a storage provider to get persisted across a PKCS12. People do expect the private keys to get loaded when they give a blob that contains a private key.
Yeah.
So to me, the double negative just makes sense because, you know, you're basically, the wording is what is the most common scenario.
Right.
Like include private keys or preserve private keys. Defaulting to true makes sense, but preserve just gives some kind of connotation to me, like it's doing something that it normally shouldn't be doing. Whereas, well, it should be preserving private keys because that's the point of the file format for most people, versus ignoring them is the exception. So you change it when you want to ignore it.
Yeah. So it's
but that's just a statement on what the default value is.
yeah, but it's just sort of encoding what a human would say. It's like load it from a PFX and keep the storage provider the same as it was written down. And that feels like it's I actually care about this little aspect. And you'd be like, oh, load it and keep the private keys. And so anybody else who knows the format would be like, yeah, what else would I do? It's like that's the reason you loaded this file format is you wanted the private keys.
Right, but I just felt like every time we've said this, we talk about keeping the private keys, using the private keys. We don't talk about ignoring the private keys. So even your language is the inverse of what's written down here.
Right, and that's just so that the default, yeah, again, it's about saying the defaults are what you would want, and you only set the setting if you want it to do the thing it says. So,
right.
Go ignore this. Yeah. Again, I don't super care. I just can't come up with what the name would be otherwise. Like, preserve private keys feels, I mean, it's semantically valid, it just feels weird in the back of my head.
Whatever. I don't think I'll ever use this API.
Fair enough. And then the last real thing is just making a public exception type for we rejected it because of one of these settings.
Do we need to say which setting? It's in the description. Well, let me rephrase my question. We're creating a dedicated type for this because we expect people to catch it.
I expect that someone like Key Vault might catch it.
And if they catch it, do they need to know which threshold they exceeded and programmatically do something about it?
I don't think they would programmatically do something about it. At most, they would report it back to the customer of why they're rejecting the upload. But it would be saying it was a limit exceeded, as opposed to like the contents were semantically invalid and we couldn't load the file, which would be just cryptographic exception. So we loaded it and we rejected it by policy versus this is gibberish. But if they already have a catch cryptographic exception, it won't break any other flows.
And there's not other policy already that's throwing a cryptographic exception?
There's not.
Okay.
And then
you have a deserialization constructor there.
I
Right.
forgot to erase it last time.
Okay.
Levi said it's not part of the contract.
Well, it's not, but you're also, the type isn't marked as serializable.
It was. I removed the attribute last time.
Oh, okay.
When Levi said the serialization is not part of the contract. It needs to be serializable on framework because exception rules on framework, but it won't be on core because exception rules on core. And then, yeah, the last piece is that we'll mark all the existing constructors as obsolete.
Can we also make a note to obsolete import on X509 Certificate 2 collection? Because that has the same problem as the constructors.
That's true.
I assume these are obsolete as warning, right?
Yep.
We'll just use some syslib diagnostic, probably.
What are you going to do on full framework, by the way? How do people know on full framework that they're supposed to install the OOP and use it?
If they work at Microsoft, an SDL violation, and if they don't, then I guess we can make an analyzer. But if they're working on framework, they wouldn't get the analyzer, so I don't know how that would help.
I can just say most people will know. I'll just keep saying that.
I mean, I'm fine with that as the message, by the way. I'm just saying, like, I mean, there's ways we could solve this problem. I mean, I think it's a general problem class, I think, for us moving forward. So to my knowledge, we don't have a built-in analyzer for framework today. We only have them in SDK style projects. So if you build regular style projects on .NET Framework, you won't get anything. But, you know, if this is a problem that we have, I think there's something we could probably do about that.
Yeah, I mean, it would be a very reasonable thing as a meta approach of we've made this thing obsolete in a future framework, and there's a thing that you can do about it now.
Right. Well, I assume that this is one of those things where it's like, well, you know, you don't know that you need it, but by the time you know, things are on fire, so maybe think about it now, kind of thing, right? So. Oh, God. Wow.
Okay. Anything else on this one?
Nope.
Aside from my inconsistency of whether the word partial appears in things or not?
Please tell me this is the last time you had to look at this, though.
Yeah, if you're good with it, Steve's still here. If Steve's run out of feedback, then I think we've exhausted it. Just too many people had to drop right before we finished it last time.
Okay.
Awesome.
Okay.
Thank you.
And so are we about to lose quorum? Are you guys bouncing to the other
Yeah, I
meeting?
gotta run.
We are.
All right. Well, thanks, Steve and Emo, for joining us. Thanks, Emo, for dressing up with me. And sorry to the people who were in line behind me, because we're out of quorum. So, with that, we are annoyingly done early, and so is the Thursday meeting a normal meeting, or is that a fake meeting, Emo?
So what was that? Is that a fake evening? Is that what
Are we streaming the Thursday meeting? I assume yes, but it could be no. You could just have the same people, but for different reasons.
No, I mean Thursday is happening, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So we're having a special Thursday review session this coming Thursday. So we will see everybody who chooses to join that one. Then it will be this big red issue at the top of the list of a new namespace called System.NET Client Model. Or we'll see if that's what it's still called at the end of the meeting. Cool. So see you on Thursday, our same .NET time at our same .NET channel. And I opened today in Spanish, so that would be adios. Oh, and I was totally going to like swing my sword and cut the camera, but I realized I need like 3 hands for that, so sorry.